Welcome to episode 11 of the Indie by Design podcast, the show about game design and game designers. In each weekly episode, we sit down with interesting people to talk about them, their work, and their outlook on games. The Indie by Design podcast is brought to you by Stace Harmon and John Robertson. You can reach us on Twitter at Indie by Design, via facebook.com/Indie by Design, and visit us at indiebydesign.net for books, podcasts, and more. You can also take a peek at what we're doing over at patreon.com/Indie by Design, where you can help us bring to life a whole host of ideas for additional content and directly help enhance our podcast offerings. This episode of the podcast is hosted by me, Stace Harmon, and features Ian Dallas, studio head and creative director of Giant Sparrow, the Santa Monica-based developer of Unfinished Swan and What Remains of Edith Finch. If you'd like to see Edith Finch in action, be sure to check out our complete 3-part no commentary playthrough by searching Indie by Design on YouTube. Ian Dallas and Giant Sparrow state that their goal is to make the world a stranger, more interesting place, and with their first 2 titles they have certainly realised that ongoing ambition. Both Unfinished Swan and Edith Finch are games that present striking, stylishly presented visual narratives and that feature poignant tales with ample room for personal interpretation. Their highly subjective stories make for games that will mean very different things to different people, but regardless of your personal take, both offer an interesting space to explore. It's with this notion in mind that we begin this week's hour-long chat with Ian, discussing how we as players determine the boundaries of our virtual playgrounds so as to better understand the freedom of our interactive journeys.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it a little bit like the way that rats work, where, rats do this thing where they hug the edges of things, which I found out recently is because rats can only see about 12 inches. Their eyes just don't focus very well, and so for them, it's just like, the safety of the known spaces. But, I mean, I think players definitely have a similar tendency to want to kind of, it's almost like when you're in a labyrinth and you just want to, turn left all of the time or whatever, to find the boundaries of it, or to get to the highest point to, survey it is, kind of a similar version of that, of just trying to, understand a space by, starting with the unknown and then chipping away at it, getting, pushing back the fog of war.
And was that something that you found with Unfinished Swan? And if so, was that something that then in any way that you're aware of kind of consciously affected the design of Edith Finch?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of, this kind of underlying tension as a designer where we're making games that are, very specifically about the unknown. It's about how do you create a space where players feel, a little bit marooned, they're out of their comfort zone. They're in this, kind of unfamiliar landscape. And then, what do players do in those situations? I think in the Unfinished Swan, it was a much more, overt version of that, where you're in this completely white landscape, and you have no idea of what might be, around the corner. And the thing that, we learned on that game was that there's this kind of counterintuitive experience that players have where, they, if you give them too much space, they kind of exhaust themselves. It's like if you put out, a meal, it's just it's too large, people feel compelled to eat it anyway. So as a designer, you have to kind of adjust the portion sizes a little bit, even though ostensibly, people sit down, to a meal and they're just I want the biggest thing. I'm so hungry right now. But they actually kind of get themselves into trouble. And, in the Unfinished Swan, we found that people would just get exhausted when there was too much room to wander around, because there's kind of 2 things that are going on, I think. One is the desire to just explore for its own sake. And then 2, and this is actually maybe the more stronger, part of the psyche, is the desire to figure out what's going on. What is it that as a player I have to do? What is the system asking of me, which is not obvious in a game like this, where normally it would be, okay, I have to kill this guy, or I have to collect, these, herbs or whatever. But in these games, it's not obvious, what you have to do. That's part of the game, right? It's figuring these things out. So the thing that we found was that by giving players more explicit goals, it actually encouraged them to relax a little bit. And then it counterintuitively felt more like they were exploring, like they had the room once they understood where they had to go. Then it was more like, okay, I know I'm supposed to go there, but I am choosing to explore this other space. And I'm now, like I've switched modes and I'm in this kind of, exploratory, wandering kind of like, experiential phase where if you don't give them the sense of where the ultimate objective is, and in the Unfinished Swan, it was, these yellow footprints that you'd follow or things on the horizon that were filled out that wasn't all white, then they never kind of switch over, and then they're always kind of on tenterhooks, a little tense about these things, which generally is not the feeling that we wanted. Like, we didn't want players to be concerned about what they were meant to be doing at a fundamental level, because they never then switch over into this kind of like place where they can relax and and enjoy what's going on.
But, I mean, there I think several things there in that answer that bring up more questions. And one of those things I think was the whole idea of a portion size, and of course, Edith Finch is very, and Unfinished One as well, to perhaps, well, to my mind at least, to a lesser degree, but Edith Finch very much so is a series of kind of discrete but connected stories, experiences that you could easily, if it were a 50-hour game, you could easily experience those in portions and be satisfied in each one. But I found I was compelled to kind of play through the entire thing in one go, and feel it was one of those experiences, I think, where I felt that I almost couldn't think too much about what was going on at the time until I'd finished it. Like, I couldn't sort out how I felt about it until I'd got to the end of it. And I wonder if the stories, the individual stories within Edith Finch, did you have a conscious desire or conscious feeling of kind of how they would piece together, like even the order that you experienced them in, for example? How did that sort of come about versus, they contrast quite well, so let's just sort of put them in this order?
Yeah, it was a very rocky process. I think we didn't look at the whole thing from the beginning very much. I mean, we, early on we did have a sense, I guess, maybe a year into development of the 4.5 years or so that we were working on it, of like, okay, here's kind of like roughly what the family is going to be like. Here's like the different generations of the family. Some like broad sense of, okay, each floor of the house is going to be like its own generation, for example, was an idea that came fairly early. But in terms of like which stories actually would fit in and where, that was all changing quite a lot, pretty late into development, because the stories themselves were changing so much. And the stories, like each individual story was such a challenge to get right, and such different challenges into the controls or just the technical issues of like, how are we going to render this world onto a cloud that you see in front of you. Those kind of difficulties plagued the project for many years, and made it so that it was all we could do to just like keep these individual stories kind of moving forward and improving, and kind of developing this sense of like, what is this game ultimately about? I mean, it was from the beginning, a game about the sublime, right? Like, that didn't change, but in terms of like how you communicate that to players, like what are the tools, what do we as a team do well, all that stuff was really, the process of discovery. And so like Lewis's story, for example, used to be one of the first stories that you would encounter. In fact, Edie's room used to be Lewis's room. It was the second story, right, that you would encounter. And I can't remember why, but we moved that story around several times. Partly, when we got a sense of how long the stories were going to be, like that was a big issue. So trying to balance lengthy stories with shorter ones, and especially early on, I think we wanted to give players a sense of roughly how big these stories were going to be. So we had one of our largest stories, Molly, followed by, ostensibly our shortest story, Odin, in the Viewmaster. And, that was a concern. Also just kind of looking at, of course, like the overall pacing, like what do we think is sort of more emotionally draining, the story to sort of give and take, and, trying to balance those things out. So like Barbara's story, is a little bit on the sillier end, which felt like a good kind of middle story to have. And, like Walter's story just kind of placed itself, right? Because that was, because it was located in the bunker and was this kind of like in-between story, it made sense that was, kind of where it fell. But all the other stories, also just got kind of tuned and adjusted, and there was no master plan. It was just like, oh, this feels a little bit better. Let's, encourage players to do this one before that one.
Yeah.
And I think, kind of what you're talking about in terms of experiencing the game and wanting to just like keep moving forward. We had initially expected that the game would be something that people would play over a couple of sittings, that it was just things were so crazy and intense that, people wouldn't want to, go through all of those things. But in the end, because we ended up shortening a lot of things and simplifying stuff, I think ultimately now the game seems to be experienced best when it's just one go, and you get this kind of whole thing that is, there's so much that by the end of the game you kind of have forgotten about, that, hopefully when players think back, it has this kind of quality of, kind of dreamlike, where it's like, oh, and that happened, and then I was an owl, and then, this thing, and I think that's, something that's very positive, right? That feels like what the game is kind of about. A lot of our efforts in the last year or so of production were, trying to reduce friction, places where, players would get stuck or confused, and, kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier with the Unfinished Swan, it doesn't really help our purposes to have people stub their toe on things and, get caught on like, oh, I just didn't notice that thing. And so we tried to make all of the, the spaces very obvious in terms of what your objective was. Like, okay, this is what is going to now take me out of this room. But, for players that want to spend time and, browse around, hopefully then they're sort of empowered to do that. But I think what we found is that that's more of like a second playthrough for a lot of people. The first time around, there's just this kind of like, I don't know, drum beat or something that gets faster and faster of like, oh, I want to know what happened to this person and that person. And, it's only probably on the second playthrough for a lot of people that they'll want to really just relax and kind of take in all of these rooms.
Yeah, but I think for me it was it wasn't like a race to the end. It wasn't I want to get to the end of this video game. It was very much like when you're reading a book and you're kind of compelled. You're just pushed through the story. You can't actually stop reading it or experiencing it or playing the game in this instance. And it has the effect of kind of, I think you're right. You get to the end and you can forget some of the stuff that you've experienced, but it adds up to this entire feeling about the game, even if you can't necessarily pinpoint some of the specific parts of it. One of the most striking things, though, even irrespective of kind of whether I could remember specific elements and every part of every story, was the tension that resulted in knowing that each character was going to die at the end of the story that I was experiencing, and knowing that, or feeling like I was in some way complicit in that, because my actions as a player were bringing them closer to that end, even though in the story thematically all of these things have already happened. It felt like this was something that I was like, kind of like my success in achieving what I was meant to be doing as a player was helping to kill these characters. And that's, some of those stories, obviously that's quite a powerful thing to feel about anybody, but some of these stories are particularly powerful in that regard. If you are in some way complicit in a baby dying or something like that, particularly if if that's relevant to your own life, and that's a very powerful thing to experience.
And yeah, I think that's actually like a great example of something that we had no idea would be there until we had a couple of these stories kind of on their feet. And, like I think Gregory's story is a great example of something that, for a long, long time just feels like a mechanic prototype where you've got this frog swimming around a bathtub and it's jumping on things and there's rubber duckies and it's just like inherently feels, really cute and playful. But because we had done a couple other stories before that one, like Molly's and Lewis's story, for example, being some of the first ones that we'd really done, and we'd gotten to a point where those started to feel really like emotionally powerful for players. We'd identified exactly, that moment you're talking about, which, like I talked about with the rest of the team as being like kind of the canonical Finchian moment is, a place where you are marching triumphantly towards your own doom.
Yeah.
And I think part of what makes that really powerful is that that's kind of the structure of video games. Like you as a player are in this weird state where you want this thing to happen, but you also know that it's going to be horrible for the people, that it happens to. And that's something that's true, I think of all stories really. Like we don't watch stories about good things happening to good people. Like that's just not interesting. But in a game, there's like a whole extra layer to that where you were, not only are you, bringing this thing into existence by being an audience member, and paying for your ticket or whatever, but you're also like, controlling this thing, like you're embedded in it. And that kind of complicity, was just like a very good match with what these stories were already about. We knew that the stories were going to be about people dying, but we didn't know until we'd done a couple of them that, there was this synchronicity with the experience of being a player and being kind of dropped into this world and the way that, you want to explore in the same way that Molly does. Like Molly wants to find, what is out there. And it's not hard to get players to want to do that. We're kind of working with the grain there of going with people's natural impulses. And the kind of culmination of all of that is, this place where even though this, person is going to die, you as a player actually, there's part of you that wants that to happen.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because that means you've kind of achieved your goal. Not deliberately. You're not deliberately trying to kill this person, but it means you've ticked a box. You've succeeded. You've got your little achievement in. I've got to the end of that section, and I wonder then, like how far did you take that with like tweaking and playtesting, and then like really turning the screws on players' emotional gauges? Like, was there conversations about kind of how much do we kind of draw this moment out? How much do we, because there are moments where you think, oh, this is going to be the point. This is where something's going to happen. And it doesn't. And you have these real, like that becomes not exhausting, but it's something that you're invested in. It becomes draining in the right way, because you're just so engaged with it. It's like, phew, and you almost get into this idea of this false sense of hope that, oh, maybe it's not going to happen. And then, of course it does. So kind of how much did you guys play with that, and, the idea of, I guess, torturing the player?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we ever wanted to torture players, but we did watch a lot of people's reactions in playtests to try to gauge, like, how much darkness are players bringing themselves to this. And I think we found pretty early on that it was a lot, right? That people, we didn't need to emphasize any of the macabre, elements. Like, we just needed to do a good job of clearly establishing what these characters wanted and what the risks were. And then we could just kind of sit back and let, it's more powerful if we let players build up the rest themselves. And, I think the biggest place where that, becomes apparent is with the music, where, a lot of times, because the music also came in a bit late, We already knew kind of where we were tonally with players, and we knew where we wanted to go. So usually that was like, oh, things feel a little bit too dark, and we'd like for the music to kind of lift things up. And it's, music is one of those few things that comes in at the end, but can make a really big emotional difference. A lot of other things, like if you want to completely redo the way that the character controls or the way that things animate, it's a much bigger challenge. But with music, you can like fine tune those moments. And so, there's a lot of very hopeful music in the game, partly because, we were coming in a little bit heavy otherwise, and the music was a way for us to, kind of subconsciously raise that up. And I think the end of Lewis's story is a good example of something where, we just wanted it to be as triumphant as possible. Because we also, we didn't want players to feel like they had failed, because, they hadn't. They're playing out these stories and they've experienced something and they've, shared hopefully like a really nice moment. And it's not like, anyone is going to live forever. Like these people are just dying maybe a little bit early, but, we tried to also structure every story so that it felt like a victory for the person in that story. So they're all stories basically of people getting what they want, but not necessarily in the way that they expected it. So even though every story ends with a death, it's not hopefully something that feels depressing. Like there is a victory in there that you as a player, can kind of share.
I think that's definitely, I can relate to that personally from playing the game. I think I can relate to that to some extent. I feel like in a weird way or a perverse way that the stories that ended or that left me feeling the most positive would have been something like Lewis's story in the fishery, where it seems like there's going to be an accident at any moment, and then actually it ends with kind of more of an affirmation of his choices, and that felt more in a strange way, given what that choice ends up being, but in a strange way that felt more empowering and I felt more at peace with that, because that was it wasn't an accident, it was a deliberate act, even though that deliberate act is speaks of a very dark mindset, perhaps. And this is one of those things, I guess, that different people are going to react differently to it, which is one of the brilliant things about something like Edith Finch and Unfinished Swan as well, that it has that room for interpretation and that a degree of ambiguity, which I think is quite a difficult thing to achieve in a video game. It's quite hard to leave that room for people's imaginations to fill in the blanks.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has come up a lot lately is the idea that this is like a story game, that people describe it as a game that's focused on story, and I don't really see it that way. I see it much more as like a game about experience and about what it feels like to be these people at these times and kind of trying out different perspectives, and that ambiguity, is a big part of something that is, not really about a message or like a final conclusion, in the way that like a story, like it's something that was written with a more definite point of view, that instead it's more of an attempt to, give you a chance to live out different experiences and then hopefully, bring some of yourself to that. So it's not, about telling people something. It's about, showing them or like giving them a space to think about.
Yeah. And I remember I spoke to somebody a while back, a game designer, who spoke about how strong an emotion remorse is in a video game, because it's quite a unique thing in terms of video games, because in order to have, and this was how they phrased it rather than how I am, but I think it was a kind of a perfect summation, that in order to feel remorse, you have to have played some part in whatever it is that's happened. So you can't feel remorse when you read a book or when you watch a film. You can feel empathy and sadness, but actual remorse at something that has happened, I guess, because it's tied up in the idea that you have caused it in some way. And again, that's kind of how I felt with Edith Finch. That was, I think there was only once when I genuinely kind of just took my hands off of the controls and just thought about not continuing. I don't think I was actually going to not continue playing, but like it was do I really want to see this through? And I think that's tied into that idea of the whole remorse thing, because I knew that once it had happened, I felt like I couldn't take it back. Even it's a weird thing, because thematically all of these things have already happened. This is a story about the past in some ways, and also about the present and the future. But it's, I don't know, was there kind of a feeling, did you explore that when you were creating the game? Did you talk amongst yourselves about this sort of idea of the whole idea of remorse and players feeling, I guess, guilty in some way about what they were playing, or because the stories were taking place in the past, did that not really kind of factor in?
Yeah, I don't think that remorse specifically was an issue that we talked about. I think, in large part because, like you're saying, this is all something that has happened in the past, and it's not like there are choices where players, could have taken the red pill or the blue pill or something. So that specifically wasn't really something that had come up. But, I think we did see that players had very different levels of experience, or not levels, like, very different emotional, takeaways or places where they got to by the end. So, I think one of the sharpest places that became obvious to me was, when we did press days for, Lewis's story, and I would sit in a room for, something like 8 hours, and then every half hour there'd be a different journalist who would come in, and they would play Lewis's story for 20 minutes, and then we would talk for 10 minutes, and then it would be on to the next person. So it was almost like a kind of scientific study, right, of how people respond to this. And it ran the gamut. There were some people who were actually speechless. Like they had to put the controller down at the end of it, and they couldn't talk for 10 or 20 seconds. They were just, sort of overcome. And there were people who were just immediately like, that was really fun. What else do you got? It was actually what they were saying. And, I think it just, so much of it depends on how open you are as a player to that experience and how deep, you connect with it. And that's kind of our job as game developers, to create a space where you as a player feel like you are rewarded for opening up, that it's something that not only does it connect with you because aesthetically and all these other elements are kind of drawing you in, but that it's also a place that, feels like it's going to be worth you, being vulnerable, and that there's something, that you can kind of experience and learn from as a human. So yeah, it's been strange to see feedback, online that kind of runs that same gamut of people who are saying oh my God, I was so overcome with this, and other people who are just I didn't get it. It was fine. Yeah. What are you people talking about? And it's the same game, but it's just different players, and they have these very different experiences, based on how much they're willing to bring to it.
It reminds me of something, I may not be. I'm assuming I'm going to be the first person to compare What Remains of Edith Finch to The Last of Us, but who knows? Maybe somebody else has. Who knows? But it was something that Neil Druckmann talked about with that during playtesting, they would have that same kind of extreme of emotions. Some people would be in tears at certain points of the story, and some people would be kind of just shrugging their shoulders. And he said the ones that kind of personally for him as a writer and a director, the reactions that hurt him the most were the ones where people were just shrugging their shoulders and saying, okay, so because he feels like he's her dad, he's going to risk, the end of the world. So that's dumb. So what? Who cares? I don't care. Yeah. Is that something for you personally as a creative person, as a creative director, do you react in that way? Do you have that kind of, that personal investment? Well, not, of course you do, a personal investment, but do you have that reaction to that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say that I actually have the opposite experience of Neil Druckmann, in that the things that hurt me the most are the people that are like ludicrously effusive about the game, about things that like don't really make any sense, and they're just babbling, and like I get taken by it a little bit, and I'm like, at first I'm like, oh wow, it's so great that this person has this really emotional experience, but you know, if you scroll up in their, you know, tweet timeline or whatever, they're like talking, you know, a few minutes earlier, they're talking about how life transforming, you know, this sandwich was for them. Whatever it is that they're experiencing, that there are people that are just like, that's who they are. Like everything, every sandwich they eat is the best sandwich they've had in their life. And your game is just like the next in that line. And, you know, it's very human, I think, to see comments about a thing you worked on and to believe whoever is talking very positively about it must really know what they're talking about and be a sensitive human being. It's not always the case. You know, and I think the players that, at least, you know, for us, go through the game and are kind of unmoved emotionally about it, but really enjoy, you know, the mechanics or, you know, the way the controls work or just the general conceit. You know, I think that's a totally fine way of looking at it. And I guess my feeling is that, you know, maybe we did a bad job and that we didn't, you know, create a space where these players felt like they could engage with it emotionally. But I also think there are people that just want different things from games. And, you know, maybe they're just, you know, not at a place right now where they want that, and they just want a thing that will show them something they've never seen before. And I really like that our game, you know, has more to offer, but doesn't demand it. I feel like there are games that, you know, are emotionally compelling that if you aren't willing to engage with it, just have nothing to give you. And I really like that ours is, you know, like kind of a bigger tent. Like it embraces players, you know, and has, you know, like a lot of different things to offer people. And hopefully, you know, there are players, I guess ideally, that come to it thinking like, oh great, this is the game where I get to be, you know, a shark and then a tentacle monster and all these other things. And then find that by the end of it, they've actually had this really emotional experience that they never expected, you know, from a game.
Welcome to the Indie by Design podcast halftime show. I'm currently sat here in full cheerleading garb. If you're interested in gaining more insight into game design and game designers, be sure to check out our website, indiebydesign.net, where you'll find more episodes of the Indie by Design podcast, our book, which is available for purchase, and a lot more besides. If you have suggestions, questions, or feedback on the podcast, you can tweet us at indiebydesign or get in touch via facebook.com/indiebydesign. If you like what we're doing and have time to leave us a short review on your podcast platform of choice, that would be very much appreciated. You can also check out what we're doing over at patreon.com/indiebydesign and directly help us make the podcast better, as well as bag some additional patron-only content. On to the second part of our discussion with Ian Dallas now, and we pick up with Ian explaining how Giant Sparrow make the tough call on when to stop polishing and improving, and how to finally say, it's done.
Yeah, I mean, on this project it was really tough because a lot of what, you know, we're doing is creating these moments of astonishment, and, you know, that comes from a lot of pieces, but the technical part of it is a very significant piece of that, of this thing that, you know, you've never experienced or seen in a game before that just like happens magically. And they're difficult magic acts to pull off. You know, like I was playing, Metal Gear Solid 5, this weekend, finally, you know, catching up on a bunch of things. And it's amazing how much flickering shadows they have, you know, for a PS4 game. But that's like, you know, the game starts with a lot of very close quarters, you know, serious discussions between people, you know, where their shadow system presumably is just like not designed for that, right? It's designed for a giant open world. And for me, that just like totally takes me out of it when I see flickering shadows on everybody's faces. You know, and for this game, like the magic is quite a bit more subtle. So, you know, we did spend a lot of time making sure that there weren't, you know, distracting shadows flickering. And in Lewis's story, that was really, really tough because the camera is positioned, like 3,000 meters away from everything in order to look kind of fake orthographic, because we couldn't do real orthographic for various other technical reasons. And each of these stories had very specific challenges from a technical standpoint. And in terms of knowing when to cut things off, I think I didn't know. And that's why we spent a lot of time working on stories that we ultimately cut, which is not, great for the production process. But we did a good enough job, obviously, that ultimately we shipped. But, looking back on it, I think it's a little heartbreaking that the stories that really worked were things that worked from the beginning. And, there are these other stories that we really wanted to do because they had these elements that seemed perfect and that, there were parts of them were really great, but were a slog from the very beginning. And they're things that just like the more you worked, the harder it got and the less, good feedback you got. And the other things that just like the curve of their improvement were very different, where like you would spend, it's like 20% of the time and you would have 80% of the story there. And then the last 20% takes 80% of the effort or whatever. Like it's hard to get to the end, but at least you were at something that already felt really good and really compelling. I think also as we got farther along, we had a better sense of what it was that we did really well as a game. So like we were talking before, the canonical Finchian moment, right, of marching joyfully to your doom was something that we said, okay, this is the core of the game. So by the end, when we were working on Gregory's story, for example, even though that story had a lot of problems, we knew that it ended in like a very typically Finchian way that we thought we could do well. And so there was a little bit more courage, that we had in terms of like committing more time and energy to that story, where other stories that didn't have a strong ending, where we didn't feel like we'd be able to stick the landing, it got cut. Cause even though there were other pieces of it that were great, it just wasn't what this game was going to do well. But early on, it was a lot of fishtailing. We did the two stories that we kind of started with, Molly's and Lewis's, the biggest stories that we ultimately did, because we realized like, oh crap, we can't actually do, many of these things. But, we kind of balanced that out, right? With some simpler stories in between, that did different things. They weren't all technical tour de forces. And hopefully they don't feel like tour de forces exactly. I mean, that's part of the magic too. Like a magic act doesn't work as well if you can see the magician sweating. It's just feel kind of lightweight.
Yeah, and I think that it comes across as many of them feel like stylistic choices rather than technical choices, or rather than, budget restrictions or whatever it might be. Like it feels like they are mixed up because, not mixed up, but mixed together because this one is deliberately designed to be maybe a bit of a palate cleanser, or it's designed to give you a moment of levity or whatever it might be. So that, I think that certainly works in that respect. So I think we're going to switch tacks entirely now. We've kind of talked about Edith Finch probably, we could probably talk about it for another 30 minutes, but yeah, very good. However, we're going to switch tack completely and talk about some of the other stuff that you've done and that you've experienced and you've kind of had going on over the last, however many crazy years it's been, like the last sort of 10 or so years, I guess. And one of those things is your time at USC. And we've spoken to my writing partner and I, John Robertson. We wrote a book called Independent by Design, and in that there are various different stories about game creation. And several of those people that we spoke to were part of USC's game program at one time or another. We spoke to Richard Lemarchand, who works at USC, and we spoke to Mark Essen of Messhoff, who taught at USC as well. And I'm wondering, is there some sort of kind of some sort of secret source, something in the water in California that, because it seems to me from a very outside and far removed perspective, a few thousand miles, that what goes on at USC seems to be very important, but very of very high caliber and very high quality. I mean, is there something different do you feel that you got from being there that I don't know, that you perhaps couldn't have got from somewhere else?
It's hard for me to say because I feel like
you weren't anywhere else, right? That's
yeah, like I didn't go anywhere else, and I feel like I got a whole lot out of USC. To be honest, like I feel like it was really, really helpful to have time to not be working at a job. Like I hadn't really appreciated how valuable it was just to have like the free headspace to go back to fundamentals and like teach myself the 3D modeling tool and, you know, basic programming and all of those things. And, you know, I think there were relationships I had with professors like Mark Bolus, who was my professor and advisor, who, you know, part of being like I had this fellowship at USC, and part of the fellowship was that every week I would have to meet with my advisor, and Mark Bolus asked me every week to come up with a new prototype for, you know, like this little game mechanic. And that's, you know, where the Unfinished Swan came out of, was every week doing these like crappy little prototypes and then talking about them and thinking about those things. And I think for me, I took a lot from the way that Mark approached design, kind of just the general thinking process that goes into that, how you sort of tackle the unknown. So like one of the things I started doing, you know, in a very concrete way at USC was to take 3x5 note cards and just draw little pictures on them of like a little moment or mechanic or idea, and then put those up on a board. And for me, you know, I think there's something about like just the way the human brain works, that you can only, you know, hold 5 to 7 things in your head at any given time. And so having like these little pictograms was a way to sort of distribute that cognitive load and think about things a little bit differently. And that's still the way that, you know, when we do stories for Edith Finch, like I would just make a whole bunch of these little things, and then, you know, you kind of think about them in a way like it gets it out of your head. And that was something that I don't think anyone necessarily taught me at USC, but, you know, in approaching design critically and kind of thinking about thinking, that was a tool that I came up with that I still find really useful. I think also at USC there's, you know, because there were some people that went there early on, and because it was one of the first programs at all, there's sort of a long tail of that, of people feeling like, oh, there's like some good folks that came out of USC. I too shall go to USC. And it's sort of like it's this kind of self-perpetuating machine. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good work that continues to come out of USC, but it's, you know, by no means the only place that good work can be done. And I don't really know enough about the other programs that exist now to be able to say, you know, what would be better for what, or if USC really so unique these days. But certainly when I was there, it was, you know, one of the 2 or 3 programs in the country or the world, you know, that was really looking at games from a critical perspective.
Yeah. Do you have any kind of contact with that kind of world of academia anymore? I don't know if it's a normal thing to have students kind of submit things to people like you guys. Are you in contact with that sort of thing?
I do occasionally get asked to like advise on master's thesis projects, so I'll come back, or like I was back a couple of weeks ago for a talk with a bunch of other USC alums for there's a video series called The Game Makers that interviewed a bunch of game developers, including a number from USC, back for that. And so, yeah, I mean, I do get drawn back in periodically, and I'm still friends with, you know, a lot of those folks, like Richard, for example.
And is there a kind of outside of that community, how do you guys kind of interact with other developers? We've spoken to some people who are very closely involved, very tight knit with the other developers in a very geographical area, and sometimes that tends to be in some of the European countries that we've spoken to developers from, who don't have maybe the biggest gaming scenes at the moment, and so they are sort of naturally more drawn together because they're all doing a similar thing. But then equally, we've spoken to some developers who, somebody as established as somebody like Introversion Software, who don't really have a great deal Like, they speak to other developers, of course, but they don't have a great deal to do with other developers. Like, where does Giant Sparrow sit in that?
Like, introversion? That does not seem that Chris and those guys.
It's almost deliberate,
Yeah, a little Swan. I think I myself, I'm like sort of by nature a little more of a hermit than most folks. So, I'm not that actively involved in the local LA group, but I think Glitch City has been pretty significant as like a co-working space that people get together and that, just sort of people are constellated around and have a meeting place to go. And Indiecade is also a pretty good place to see. That's historically been in Culver City. I think this past year is in downtown LA. People kind of orient around that. And it was just, like a small enough group of people historically that there's just a lot of, friends that would get together. And, like Baruch Pfeiffer is having a party at his house, to celebrate this or that. And then, a bunch of people will show up to hang out. But in terms of like the sort of more official things, I think the Glitch City has a co-working space and, festivals like Indiecade are a place that bring people together. And then USC, just like events go on and people will give talks or whatever. And, it's just, I think Twitter, as much as anything probably is the place that people congregate around even, when they're in the same geographical area. It's surprising how much game development sort of communication has migrated the last couple of years.
There's a gold mine in there somewhere, I imagine. If somebody went through and collated all of the collective game design wisdom that's been put out on Twitter, there's enough to fill several books, I would imagine. But it's quite a transient thing, I guess. You tweet, and although it does stay there forever, theoretically, it's yesterday's news pretty quickly. But the kind of moving on to how you guys work in terms of your development stages, your pre-production and post-production, and I don't know if you're a big enough studio or if you like to take time out from when you're developing one game to start working on ideas for another, but do you have a kind of a method of, as you're wrapping up one game, you start to think about the next, or like what do you do when you finish a game? Do you go on a long vacation? Do you give yourself some headroom? How do you actually sort of deal with that end of a development cycle?
We've only had the two experiences so far, right? Of after Unfinished Swan and after What Remains of Edith Finch. And, I think as a studio, it's not really I don't think of it as a business, as much as I think about it as just kind of more like a band, like a group of people that get together to make this thing and, then disperse. So, after the Unfinished Swan, I think at our peak, we were maybe around 12 or 13 people, and then full-time, and then by the end of it, we were down to 3. I think we were starting Edith Finch, and then amped up from there. And so I think, we'll probably have a similar roll-off and ramp-up. Like now we're down to 5 people from a peak of around 15 or 16. And, I'm not quite sure what that number will look like, but I think one of the lessons from Edith Finch for me is that, when we're starting to make these things, we just have no idea what we're really doing. And it's difficult to add people early on in that process because they want to know what to work on. And I want to tell them, I don't want to have them doing things that are just going to get thrown out. So, I think with Edith Finch, there was a lot of pressure from Sony to, try to get it done, within, a certain calendar period, even if it meant, spending a little bit more, to bring in more people. And that seemed like a fine thing. And then, unfortunately, like a year or two into it, we just still didn't know what we were doing. But we had all these other people around that, needed stuff to do. And so that just took a lot of time to manage and come up with tasks. And so I think the next time around, we'll have a smaller team for a longer period. And, even when we think we know what we're doing, by the time it gets to like a real prototypey stage, and we can start to play with it ourselves. There's just a lot of things to discover. And, you realize like, oh, we actually need, somebody full time to do, fluid effects or whatever it is that like this next game is going to require. So I think it's very, iterative, I guess, and exploratory, maybe is a better word in the beginning of, starting from, a very specific feeling, like in Edith Finch, it was the sublime horror of nature. And so we initially worked on things like scuba diving prototypes and what it felt like to be in the middle of a dark forest. And the whole format of short stories and all that kind of grew out of seeing what these little prototypes felt like. So it's kind of making things and then seeing just like how that feels to you as a player, and using types as kind of ways to think about these ideas a little better.
And so is that how it starts, or is that how it has started each time? And perhaps if you have already started working on your new thing, is that how it's kind of translated across or ported across, that you start with that central idea? Because as you were talking, then I was thinking, it sounds a bit like it's like the analogy of a band that you mentioned previously. That it kind of sounds like you're all just sort of jamming. But is it actually that you start with quite a fixed idea as to what it is you're trying to achieve, and then things come out from that central point?
Yeah, I think we start with a feeling. Like we start with kind of an emotional touchstone, and like in the Unfinished Swan, it was more about like awe and wonder. Like that actually came from the prototype in a way. Like it was this mechanical prototype we had of throwing paint in a white landscape, and there's just like, what does that feel like? What is it? And for me, it was like, what does it feel like to be, confronted with the unknown? Like, how do you make something that is about the experience of the unknown? And so, yeah, when we start with just a very simple feeling, like for the next game, it's about the way that animals move and like, what does it feel like to look at an animal moving? Like, why is that compelling, in kind of a similar way to watching a campfire? That you can just endlessly watch this thing, and there's something that is very primal and human and mysterious, but like I can feel it. I know it's there, but I can't explain it, and I don't really know how to evoke it. That's kind of the jumping off point. For the next project is just kind of thinking about what is this feeling. Like E.O. Wilson talks about it as biophilia, as kind of innate connection that humans have for animals that is mysterious. Like other animals don't seem to have it. Why do we have it? Like it's something, that's kind of unknown, but also it's right there. Like you can feel it. So that's kind of, the way these things work is we start from something that's powerful and a little mysterious to us. And then, we just explore that, until somebody tells us to stop.
Yeah, see, that's the benefit of having a strict structure of a publisher's timeline. Somebody has to say, look, guys, come on, you really have to actually make a game now. You can't just keep experimenting.
And I think we too also feel like, okay, this is there's a point at which you've spent enough time cogitating about something, and it is really nice, and you do learn more too. I think in trying to actually make these expressions of them and refine them. And I think, we're all really happy to be done with it at the end of the day and to have something that, we can look back on as kind of a finished piece of work and not just, endless scribblings.
Do you feel like there doesn't sound like there's a great deal of connection between each project, but do you feel like you are kind of, be it from a technical standpoint or even just a developmental milestone standpoint, do you feel like there are lessons that you take from each project that you can point to and say, well, this happened on Unfinished Swan, or now this happened on Edith Finch, and so we are either going to replicate that or we're going to do our best to avoid that? Like, does it work in that kind of, in that tangible way, or is it more kind of abstract and sort of just undefined or ill-defined? Like, is there a thing you can point to and say, yeah, that this is what we're learning, or is it just, well, this is a completely new game, completely new ideas, therefore, who knows? Who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah, it's a slightly complicated answer, but, I think that what I am personally really interested in is learning and in trying new things and in creating experiences that people have never had before. So, the sort of core through line is that everything is constantly changing. So the similarity is the difference, I guess, between each of the projects. But I think also in looking at the way that Edith Finch developed and certainly the way that it looks now in its final form, there are a lot of themes and elements that recur, unintentionally. I think the most prominent one for me would be the theme of the perils of the imagination, which is very front and center in Unfinished Swan, and is kind of a little bit under the surface, but very much there also in Edith Finch. Not something that I ever thought about when starting the project, but it's just that's something that really interests me and finds its way in. I think also my interest in books and what it feels like to read a book, the way that turning a page, is this entirely new world and, place for, new things to happen. And, looking at like our bookshelf of all the references from the Unfinished Swan, I realized like, well, there are a lot of those that actually could be references for Edith Finch as well. Things like Alice in Wonderland or Shel Silverstein, or Edward Gorey. And so, I think there's a level of, like, at a level of references at least, a lot of the same kind of tonal and stylistic things we look to are somewhat similar across the games that we've made. But yeah, hopefully they all feel pretty different, and from a technical standpoint, are trying different things, because that, is really a big part of, to me, what is interesting about games is the kind of technical aspects of it and the way that, the controls, can change, and the way that it's not just, like the same wine poured into new skins or whatever, that it's like a wholly new experience that you can create every time. And I think a lot of games don't bother with that. Like, they're just not interested. But, that's something that is really interesting to me, creating something out of whole cloth that feels brand new.
Yeah, I can't really imagine that I'm going to be hearing too many announcements about What Remains of Edith Finch 2 or the finished Swan or anything like that. I think it might be. I can see that you guys are going to be doing something quite new each time.
We do talk about the Finch Pets DLC project now and again. So who knows? That might see the light of day. But when you were mentioning earlier about the kind of the ideas that didn't make it into the game, I was thinking like that would make for a great kind of director's cut version of the game that has all of the unfinished prototypes. That would be a nice fit with the unfinished Swan as well, because it's kind of like his stuff that wasn't quite finished. So yeah, it's kind of a, I guess there's more, in very brutal commercial terms, there's more mileage there if you wanted to kind of get more out of the game in that sense. But is that something that you guys have? Do people ask you about that? Like, they want, I want more stories in this world. Is that something that you've had to field any questions on at any point about, you could just kind of build an extension on the house and just bolt a few more, do another branch of the family tree. Like, is that something that's come up at any point? Yeah, people certainly do, I think a lot of people say, hey, I wish this game was longer. I wish that there were more stories in this universe. Of course, part of the magic on our side is that, all these stories are really just as long as we feel like we can get away with before it becomes the least bit tedious. So if players leave it feeling like, man, I wish that was a lot longer, like we are secretly cackling to ourselves, knowing that like any longer and you would, get jaded about it, and it's kind of like, oh, we got out just at the right time. But no, I think down the road, there's probably it wouldn't be as simple as just, opening a basement, like a sub basement or something, in the house. But, in terms of, a collection of short stories, perhaps dealing with, some of these same characters, or, an entirely different branch of the family, or even something, like, as silly as it is, like a collection of stories about the pets of the Finches, could be something that, we want to explore. And one of the ideas that we actually had, for this game was that we would bring in guest developers to do some of the stories, and that try to, add some more variety that way. So, it's not impossible, but I think as a studio, we are very oriented around, doing new things. So if we did something, more in this world, it would have to be something very new and not just, an extension of what's already there.
For more on games and game creators, visit indiebydesign.net. Follow Indie by Design on Twitter, Facebook, and on YouTube, where you'll also find a full walkthrough of what remains of Edith Finch. Do consider nipping over to patreon.com/indiebydesign to see what we have going on over there, and to bag yourself some additional podcast content, as well as to get the warm, fuzzy glow of helping us make this podcast even better. Indie by Design podcast episodes are released every Wednesday, and we hope to have you back here next week. The music used in this episode is owned and provided by Ben Prunty.